To many, the decision from the Overwatch developers, Team 4, to drop the 2 from Overwatch 2 and go back to just calling it Overwatch comes off as a pretty tacit admission that the whole concept of Overwatch 2 was a stupid idea from the start. And for that reason, they get a lot of flack. Now, how do I put this? People are completely right in saying that is what it is. Absolutely, I'm not here to convince you it isn't. Yes, dropping the 2 is basically just an admission. Yeah, Overwatch 2 was a stupid idea in the first place, no one liked it anyway, let's just get back on track. But as someone who has been following the game for the past few years and has been playing a lot of Overwatch ever since the beginning of Overwatch 2, I have to say, I also find it a little frustrating almost how much people want to complain about it. I completely understand. I want to make it very, very clear from the beginning here. I completely understand, especially from the outsiders who don't have a lot of context on what's been going on behind the scenes, that you look at this and it just looks stupid and you want to dunk on it. But I guess just to kick off the video, I'll try and put this in as few words as possible and then get more into it as we get further through the video. To me, it's frustrating to see people still complaining about the fact we dropped the 2, because, yes, everyone knows Overwatch 2 was a stupid idea. The developers knew Overwatch 2 was a stupid idea. Even Team 4 almost certainly did not want to do Overwatch 2, but were made to do Overwatch 2. It happened. It's over. Can we please just move on now? That's why sometimes, even though I completely sympathize and understand, I find it kind of annoying when I still see people drilling in the whole point of, oh, well, the whole Overwatch 2 situation was stupid. It's like, yes, we know. Can we move on now? That being said, you might be wondering, how did it even happen? If no one wanted it in the first place, why did the whole Overwatch 2 thing happen in the first place? Well, just before I get into that, a little bit of an explanation of the sort of chain of command here. You see, the actual development team behind Overwatch is called Team 4. They are obviously a part of Blizzard, and Blizzard is owned by Activision. Now, I think most of you know this, but just for those of you who don't, Blizzard used to have a very good reputation as a games company, but it took a nosedive when they were bought out by Activision. Now, a lot of people hate Blizzard. From my perspective, Blizzard probably genuinely did used to be a good company, but clearly whatever goodness used to exist was absolutely hollowed out when Activision bought them out. And to be frank, I know a lot of people like to say screw Blizzard, screw the Overwatch devs, but a lot of the things that made Overwatch the way it is today, a lot of the problems that were caused, to me, I attribute to Activision more so than Blizzard or the developers Team 4. Especially its head at the time, Bobby Kotick, who absolutely drove this game into the ground, and I am so glad he's no longer got his grubby fingers on it. You see, I always had a pretty strong belief in Overwatch 2's ability to bring it back in the long term. That sure, right now, Overwatch 2's release is going to disappoint people, and that there's going to be problems at first. But I did believe that give it a few years and Overwatch will be back on its feet. However, there was a moment where my faith wavered, and I cracked. When the PvE was announced as paid DLC, even though they'd already kind of weakly admitted, it's not going to be the complete vision we had initially, sorry guys, that's when I lost it. Now in fairness, they always said the PvE was likely to be paid DLC, but I thought once they'd admitted that it wasn't going to be their original vision and it wasn't going to be to the same scale, they would probably either make it so it isn't paid DLC anymore, or make it so maybe the full experience is paid DLC, but there's some sort of free demo, for lack of a better way to put it. The fact that there was absolutely no free little taste of what the PvE was like for people was kind of what made me lose my mind. Because already, I didn't really care that much about the PvE, and I wasn't sure how good an idea it would be. But the one thing I thought was, well, at least if they give us a bit of free PvE to work with, even if it's a disappointment, if it's a free thing everyone can get a little taste of, maybe some people will be like, okay, never mind, I like this a bit more than I expected. Like, sure, this is still a stupid situation, but you know, I enjoyed playing the game. The fact it was paid kind of made me crash out. Especially because at the time, Microsoft was trying to buy out Activision's properties, and the buyout had been blocked, making it look like Bobby Kotick was going to own this game forever. And again, Bobby Kotick in particular has done such a terrible job mismanaging Overwatch that I thought as long as he stayed in any way involved with the game was only going to go downhill. Now thankfully, the buyout did end up going through much later, and now Microsoft owns Overwatch. Not that Microsoft had been doing an amazing job or anything, but you literally physically could not do a worse job than Bobby. That's part of the reason why I've had a lot of hope for the game from here on out. Because I want to be clear, I really do have full faith in the current development team behind the game. I've had a few balance concerns, who wouldn't, but other than that, I really feel like this is a team that is way more responsive than what we had in the past. and a team that's really been handed a smoldering corpse of a franchise and been doing everything they can to use necromancy to resurrect it from the dead. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a little off topic, but to get more back on topic, let me talk about why Activision was so bad for Overwatch. The big one is, it's basically an open secret that Overwatch 2 was an Activision idea. They seem to see it like a Call of Duty. I mean, it's a shooter game, right? Every shooter game's just Call of Duty, right? Just make another game, lol. Gotta remember, these are like boomers. They make money off of games. They almost certainly do not play them, or play them to a very minimal extent. They do not have an understanding of why people like the games they make. They just know the games they make money. They did not like that Overwatch was getting free updates, that new characters weren't something you had to pay for. And so they pushed hard for Overwatch 2 to be made. Now, the PvE wasn't necessarily their idea. That is on the fault of the original Overwatch development team. Even then, I can sympathize where they were coming from. Essentially, because they had this dropped in their lap, because they knew that Overwatch was not a COD game, it was not the kind of thing where they can just make another game next year. They realized, okay, if we just make an Overwatch 2 and it's just Overwatch with a few new characters, everyone's gonna hate it. You know what? They were right about that one, can't lie there. But what if there was actually some kind of spin on Overwatch's typical gameplay that they wanted to implement anyway, that they could then turn into essentially a second game, quote unquote? Well, then they get to kill two birds with one stone. They get to spend some time trying something creative and different that they wanted to do, but would be too different from the original Overwatch to be worth justifying if it weren't for the fact that now they have this excuse of, well, this is Overwatch 2. We're making the next Overwatch, the better Overwatch. And one of the things the original dev team was very fond of was the PvE archives missions that they had made. Which, to be fair, I think most people did enjoy, even if they weren't super replayable. The only problem was that the Overwatch 1 game engine was not built for PvE, it was built for PvP, and so it was always being pushed to the limit to make those archives missions function. If they wanted to make a full PvE Overwatch game, well, they'd have to completely revamp the engine to make it functional. And that'd be a lot of work. That would be years of dev time. But hey, if you're making a new game, it's the perfect excuse, right? Oh, yeah, we can put loads of hours of dev time into this because it's a new game. That's a fine justification. Only, of course, we all know the story. So much went wrong while walking down this path. And Activision Blizzard ran into so many problems just as a company while they were working on this. So many dev hours were wasted on so many things, especially so many things that people would have actually wanted that higher-ups decided, nah, just can it. In particular, there are reports that they had almost fully completed developing a map editor for the game so that people could make their own community-made maps. And then the higher-ups just said, meh, scrap it, we don't want it. So if you're wondering where all those dev hours went for Overwatch 2, you have Activision to blame for that, and maybe even Bobby Kotick himself personally. So yeah, Overwatch has been going through it. However, to be fair, most of this stuff was happening in the early 2020s. I would say starting around 2023, Overwatch 2 started to find its feet. And from then on out, it's basically just been a constant story of us trying to rebuild this game's reputation bit by bit. We can't do it immediately, we can't just materialize years and years of effort out of nothing. It takes time, but we've been trying to build back there. And to be honest, I feel like the developers genuinely have done a pretty remarkable job. I mean, if it wasn't already clear, this video is kind of targeted at people who maybe aren't as invested in Overwatch, but have a passing knowledge of it, more so than most of my normal videos. So I know that many of you watching already know, but like, for those of you who've been out of the loop a little bit, the roster probably about doubled in size since the last time you played if you haven't played since Overwatch 1. Not only is there obviously a lot of just typical graphical upgrades, a lot of quality of life stuff, but generally speaking, the game has been good recently. Like this past year we've just had, the only dark spot for me has been this final season, Season 20, before we get this big reboot in the next season. Season 20 has not been a super fun time. Almost everyone has not liked this season. However, other than Season 20, I've pretty thoroughly enjoyed basically every single season this year. The meta has been consistently diverse and consistently uplifting characters that are particularly high skill or particularly healthy for the game, which is great news. And hey, if you want me to put it in more simple terms for classic OG Overwatch players who haven't played in a while to understand, Genji's been unironically pretty damn good basically the entire year, and has even been the best DPS in the game for a few patches during this year. So, you know, that's a good sign. And sure, there's been a lot of effort wasted on the PvE that has kind of, you know, not really landed the way they wanted it to. but they've done what they can to salvage the development time put into there. Obviously, beyond the fact we just got a lot of engine upgrades along the way, thanks to all the work they were doing on the PvE. Also, a lot of the mechanics that were made for PvE have been repurposed either as perks that characters can select to give them extra special abilities mid-match, or in Stadium mode, the mode where you can buy items and powers that give you unique abilities your character wouldn't usually have. So a lot of the work that didn't end up being implemented as intended that they did for PvE at least got to be reused somewhere. As is right now, I am actually really excited for what's going to happen next season, and I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the future of this game again. I guess what I want to get across to people who maybe don't know everything that's been going on and have just been like, well, them dropping the 2 is just embarrassing, it's so shameless and all that, is that like, yeah, it's embarrassing, yeah, it's bad, but it's also about something that happened like 4 years ago now. There's a certain point where we have to just move on and just make a goddamn good game already. And I guess that's just what I want to keep the focus on, the fact that they are improving the game. And hey, if there is something you still hate about the game as it is right now, let them know about it. This is a version of the development team that actually listens to feedback. We're not used to this because in old Overwatch, as much as people like to idolize the original devs, they actually were really stubborn. They often never listened to anything the community had to say, and even once they heard a unanimous cry from the community that they wanted something, they would say, yeah, well, you think you want that, but you don't actually want it. And then eventually, after enough pressure, they might add a version of kind of what the community said, but they'd always put their own spin on it and make it something that wasn't what we wanted. And then when we don't like it, they'd say, see, you don't like it anyway, do ya? Hero bands are a great example. People were asking for those for years, and the Overwatch 1 dev team, instead of giving us that, said, okay, fine, we'll give you what you want. Here's hero pools, where you can only play a select few heroes every now and then. And it's like, no, that's not what we asked for. We asked for bans in competitive. And they say, see, you don't like it anyway, see? Well, we kept asking for hero bans. We got them in competitive now. This is a version of the Overwatch development team that listens. Hell, a bunch of the developers actively watch the YouTubers and streamers now and listen to the feedback they give. We have had times that balance patches have been influenced by developers literally watching the live streams of pro players and talking with them. We've had so many more developer interviews since the beginning of Overwatch 2 in general, and in those interviews we've been hearing about developers watching even smaller channels and hearing what they have to say about the current state of the game. Hell, it's a little out there because of course I'm a little on the smaller side, but there is a non-zero chance that someone on the Overwatch team has seen at least one of my videos. I'll probably never know, but it is really nice to think that. Kind of throwing this in as a bit of a bonus point on the end, I admit, but I really wanted to mention it in a video like this. I understand this could kind of come across like I'm begging for old Overwatch players to come back, but not only am I not a Blizzard employee, at least no one has proven that in a court of law, but on top of that, there's some truth to that. I do think that there are some people who probably genuinely liked Overwatch, had a bit of a bad period with it, fell out of the game, and never came back to it, who would probably love it if they came back to it now. But to be fair, I also think the majority of people who quit Overwatch at some point and never came back and became one of these jaded exes that talk about how much they hate Overwatch now, but also haven't played it in like 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I think for a lot of these people, it's just genuinely that they are the kind of people that doesn't like the kind of game that Overwatch is. And it's actually probably a good thing that they just stop playing Overwatch and never come back. Because Overwatch can be the kind of game it's trying to be really well, and they're still gonna hate it, because they don't like the kind of shooter Overwatch is. I feel like no one says this, but I personally get the impression, having talked to a lot of people who are outside the sphere of Overwatch who fell out of it at some point, that the kind of thing that makes Overwatch especially fun when compared to other shooters is something that is actually, while very enjoyable for people who understand the niche, pretty niche. It requires a lot of specialized knowledge to fully appreciate Overwatch as a game because it's so weird and different to other shooters. And if you want a more standard shooter where it's just about pure mechanics, then yeah, Overwatch is probably a terrible game for you, because there's so many situations in Overwatch where not understanding how the game works differently to other shooters leads to you just dying even if you perform well, because it's not about how well you perform, it's also about how smartly you attack the situation. But for some people, they just want a shooter where all that matters is performing well. When they play a shooter, they just want to play a shooter where if they hit shots and they have the schmovement, they win every time. And the only way they can lose is by missing. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you like shooters like that, then go ahead, play shooters like that. It's just, you probably wouldn't enjoy Overwatch, because there are so many situations in Overwatch where maybe you do hit every shot, but because of your positioning, you're dead anyway. Or maybe you do have the movement, but because of the CC the enemy team has, you're dead anyway. For me, it's obviously the opposite. I'm actually, generally speaking, not super into shooters, but I really like Overwatch because shooting is kind of the least important part of Overwatch, despite the fact it's nominally a shooter. But for someone who has the other perspective of they like shooter games and that's why they play Overwatch, I think there's plenty of people who may have tried Overwatch just because it's a shooter game and it was a big thing, and probably wouldn't genuinely want to come back to it, even if it's in a quote-unquote better state for its player base right now, because these people just aren't the kind of people who are the player base for Overwatch. And that's fine. You can have games that not literally everyone in the planet loves, and that doesn't mean it's a bad game. It just means what that game's trying to appeal to is not something that everyone appreciates. Again, because Overwatch was such a big thing initially, when it first had its meteoric rise to fame, I really do think a lot of the players we lost, while people like to pretend that, oh, we just did something to drive them all away, I really do think a lot of them are just people who needed time to realize Overwatch is not the kind of game they like. So that being said, for any of you who genuinely do like the kind of game Overwatch is, but just feel like it was mismanaged along the way, I do recommend giving it another go right now if you haven't played it in a while. Especially if you haven't played since the addition of perks. Perks have been a great addition to the game. With all that said though, thank you for watching. Hopefully this gives you a bit more insight as to why the whole Overwatch 2 debacle happened, and gives you an idea of whether that would make you want to come back to the game, or whether you think you're fine keeping your distance from it. With all that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.